Good morning and welcome to one on the almshouses and the poor. I'm really going back to the 10th century, really, and then going to finish in 1947 with the formation of the NHS, although these almshouses still continue today. There's around about in Britain over 2,000 almshouses still in use today, and some of these we'll see as we go through are still lived in. So let's have a quick look at the the originations of them. And oddly, it goes all the way back to York in 937 with the establishment of St Leonard's Hospital. It wasn't called St Leonard's Hospital to begin with, but St Peter's Hospital, obviously because it was in the grounds of York Minster, St Peter's Church, and that's how it got its first name, and was founded by King Athelstan. And how that sort of came around was that forces had been opposed to him after his fighting back of the Vikings in 927, and he came up to York to oust the Vikings, and they went northwards into Scotland. Having done that, it made him the first king of all England. But 10 years later, he had to come back to fight these massed forces, which are, I guess, raiding into the north of England from there. And one of the first things he did was to go to Beverley, where he prayed at the relics of St John of Harpham in Beverley Minster. And he then carried his banner in front of his troops as I guess, as a sign of good luck. Now, this battle that took place in 937, called the Battle of Brunembur, people aren't quite sure where it was. Some people say that it was on around Barton-on-Humber, the south side of the Humber Bridge. Other people say that it was at Little Wheaton on the Wolds. Others say that it was at Loughborough. And these were all mentioned in texts of the 13th century, so 300 years after the battle took place. Other people said that it took place on the Wirral, and others that it took place in County Durham. But like I say, there's 3 or 4 locations in Yorkshire, and obviously he went to Beverley and then came back to York in 937. And really, as part of that, he then gave Beverley the right of sanctuary, and he founded the St Leonard's or St Peter's Hospital in York, really the very first one of those. Why, we don't really know, because really these hospitiums or hospitals were not as hospitals as we know them today. And so these would be for really old people who couldn't really look after themselves. So perhaps he'd seen a lot of those people in York and thought that he could do something for them around there. And say it was called not a hospital or a hospitium or anything like that to begin with, but they were called bead houses. Bead is the Anglo-Saxon word for prayer, and it's probably where the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle of Bede got his name from as well. And so they were really for the poor and old who were sick, infirm, or could no longer look after themselves. They were run really as a Christian charity. The one in York eventually came to be run by the Augustinian monks, whereas over the wall were the Benedictine monks of St Mary's Abbey, because this was preceded the building of the Abbey really by 100 years or so. And they were funded by alms. So it weren't really particularly people going out collecting alms, but I guess it was established by King Athelstan, is then other notables would then come to seem to support St Peter's Hospice, largely a sign probably of approval by King Athelstan and to get near him. And so they weren't really collecting alms, but alms were given freely to support the hospital around here. And so that's what sort of the word alms means, the giving freely of money, food, and other gifts for the poor and needy. Because it's distinct from begging, which is normally generally outlawed as being illegal, and I think it probably still is today, because you're sort of really demanding money or goods off people, or cadging, or whatever it is you might like to call it. So really, St Leonard's in York, in the Museum Gardens, is the father of all almshouses in Britain. It's amazing that found York is right at the forefront of that as well. So let's just have a quick look here. You probably won't be able to remember any of these places because I'm going on for over 2 sessions, but really the sort of spread that I'm looking at, and in no particular order, we've got them over out at Scarborough. There's a Seafarers Mission out there. Thornton le Dale, built by Lady Lumley there. Richmond is, I've chosen that because it's got a road called Maison d'Eur, God's House, which is a sort of almshouse, as we'll see as we go down. Masham has 2 almshouses there. Bentham over there, Long Preston by the side of the main road going up into the Dales, Linton, which I showed a few weeks ago, Beamsley, which I've shown quite often by the side of the Harrogate Road near Bolton Abbey roundabout. Where else are we going? Carlton in Craven, a very unusual one there because it's on like a Roman open-sided square, that one is. Waddington, again, is still the family that established that, the Parker family, are still trustees of that after sort of 300 or 400 years. Holmfirth is a rather unusual one because that was funded from subscriptions raised by the public after the flooding of the Home Valley by the Bilbury Dam disaster in 1852. Where else am I looking? Sheffield, right there, a licensed victualler's almshouse near Dore, Totley, down there. Where else am I looking? Wakefield, because there's public dispensaries there, as there were in Knaresborough and other towns as well. Halifax, I could do a whole talk on the almshouses of Halifax, as similarly that you can do on Pontefract as well, and Beverley, that's why I've included those over there, and Ripon itself, and I've concentrated on Ripon this time because they're more easily seen. Where else am I looking? Leafley, because it's in a rural location, Ledsham, because they're built behind the church, and again built by the lord of a manor, and he very specified what people had to wear there as well. And that one up there of Aberford, 1844, that cost £40,000 to build, and there's only accommodation for 12 people in that. So I think that's picked up most of them. I'm looking around that map to see if there's any more. Oh yes, Knaresborough up there because it's got a poorhouse in there. There's also a public dispensary, as I mentioned before. And I'm going to end at Nid because those near Nid Hall, the hotel, there's some red brick almshouses there. They were built in 1900, not replacing any other almshouses as well. So that's where I'm really taking this sort of almshouses to. They've been built and rebuilt many times, so there aren't that many original almshouses left. So let's have a look at the first one I'm going to look at. I'm going to continue the story of St Leonard's Hospice, because the ruins you see today aren't that of 937 because it burnt down in 1137. So perhaps there's a sort of something to do with the numbers there as well. And as I mentioned before, it was inside the city wall in the precinct of York Minster, and that precinct then ran all the way down to down to the river, because where you get on for those river cruises down there is St Leonard's Landing Place, because that's where it stretched all the way down to as well. So these were Augustinian monks, which is unusual because on the other side of the wall, just behind where I've taken this photograph, is St Mary's Abbey with the Benedictine monks in there. And it's unusual because, as we see later on, or fairly soon, is that the monks weren't really involved in the building or running of almshouses at all. I think they probably saw themselves above that, or they liked their privacy inside their own walls and things like that. So the ward here was really on the first floor, because it was a lot bigger than this, because it actually stretched further down past the foundations of York Theatre Royal and around there. So this is only a small part of what's left of a hospital. Underneath there would have been a sort of chapel and undercroft under here for storage of goods, whereas people would have been living on the first floor. There are no descriptions of it, so we're not quite sure what happened in there, but I'd guess there would be smelly, noisy, and very dark places, and there wouldn't have been really any help for you, really, because you've only been restricted probably to local potions and things like that. But because they'll probably administered these people by nurses. So we're not really quite sure how many people would have been in here, but I guess 30 to 50 people, perhaps, probably on straw palisters and things like that. So fairly unhygienic conditions that they lived in there. And we say there's always normally a religious aspect to becoming an alms person, and is that you'll be expected to pray for the founder of a hospital. And perhaps that's where King Athelstan was coming from. He probably thought that he couldn't compete with York Minster, and therefore if he built this, then such as the charity chapels that came along in the mid-14th century, is that they could pray for him as well. And so normally living with these people would have been a cleric, probably somebody who'd retired or who themselves were ill or whatever it was, and it would have been that cleric in there that would have taken those daily services that the people would have had to attend. And then we see, sort of coming on into this period, Oswald, Archbishop of York, he died in 992. Early every morning during Lent, he washed the feet of 12 impoverished men, then humbly served them breakfast. So it sort of continued on from then. As we'll see, other kings became involved as well. So this is a picture of the, I guess the hospitium at Fountains Abbey, largely because is that the monks really didn't provide for the local poor. They were more welcoming guests into the abbey, and those guests would be bringing money with them. And that's why they built these sort of dormitory style accommodation for those, I guess, pilgrims coming to visit and other people on sort of spiritual journeys. And they would come and live in these purpose-built dormitories inside the compound of Fountains Abbey. So this is what we have here. This is really the undercroft, and again is that people lived on that first floor. But if you're seeking alms, is that you'd come to the gatehouse of the abbey, and I guess you'd knock on the door or something like that, and they might provide you with food, clothing, or a little bit of money, but you couldn't go any further than that. So it was really off limits after that. And then also looking at the poor, we have the Queen today who still gives them Maundy money. And that first happened at Knaresborough on the 15th of April, 1210. King John, who's quite actually disliked, but didn't have an affinity to Knaresborough. This again was, I guess, Easter time this was, and he gave 13 pence to 13 paupers. Why it was 13 pence? Because that was symbolic of the 12 apostles plus Jesus. And you can say, as beyond that, he gave garments, forks, food, and other gifts to the poor. So that was really the first instance of Maundy money being recorded. I'm going to say it's Maundy because it's the Thursday before Good Friday. So that's how it gets its name. So let's move on, because we said that the monks of the great abbeys and things like that weren't really involved in it. So who were sort of involved in building these almshouses? Well, one of the earliest that we can't see but can see, because I'm going to look at Ripon as a town, because they're sort of fairly easy to see around the town centre, and again you can see them in York and Beverley as being really the great cathedral cities of the north. If you look at this picture here, it says down here, this is on the not the town end, but the other end of Bondgate Bridge. Bondgate Bridge crosses the River Skell and goes up towards the cathedral itself. If we look on the bottom here, it says the ancient foundation, AD 1109, of the hospital and chapel of St. John the Baptist. So this is really one of the earliest recorded after St. Leonard's Hospital in York. And it was founded in 1109, fell into disuse only in 1722 as an almshouse, and then became a boys' school. Unfortunately, it was demolished in 1868, and the church that you see behind it, the chapel, was then rebuilt on that site. So unfortunately, there's really nothing for us to see at all. But like I say, that lay next to this River Skell on the south side of it. This is the almshouse of St Anne's. This is on Hyacinth Agnes Gate. Agnes is a corruption of St Anne's, and that's how it gets its name. And people aren't quite sure when this was founded. The road was built in 1228, but the almshouse here was only first mentioned in 1438, but it looks so that the chapel here, that was all that remains of it, is probably far older than that. So it's the cathedral is just up here. Behind the modern almshouses, which on the next photograph, is the River Skell. So that's where it lies between. So the river lies at the bottom of the banking that leads up to the cathedral. You can walk up some steps to it from here. And this was a hall that stood attached to this. So this is the chapel that we can see, but standing in front where the garden is today and probably built into it, you can probably just see the outline of another building just there. And that was a hall or a ward, I probably could correctly say it. So this was for men and women. So I guess men were one side and women the other side. And so there weren't many people here. Most of these almshouses, even the ones which are still around today, are very small. I think the smallest in Yorkshire holds is just two cottages, so really up to either 2 people or 4 people. So they can be quite small. This was probably around about 10 or 14 people that could live in here. And it seems though that the beds would be arranged along either side of the wall and subdivided perhaps to make them into cubicles, so there's a bit of privacy, whereas St Leonard's Hospital might have just been open plan, where you're sort of living as a community all together, because they're not probably particularly hygienic at all, with the all sorts of illnesses spreading around very rapidly in places like that. And so, but perhaps those cubicles could be pushed back and they would eat in the place. We know later on is that there was added onto the building, which you can't see here. But again, there was a resident cleric that lived on here. He was a blind one, because it's where it sort of came in from, I guess, within the Ripon diocese or something like that. They would come down here if they needed that help. And he'd be the person that took the services. He was given 2 rooms, so I guess he had a bedroom and probably a living room or something like that. Later on this one, they built onto it a sort of kitchen and a dining room as well. So that's really how it looked in probably in the 19th century before it was demolished. Those people living in, and probably that ward had been then subdivided properly into rooms rather than perhaps mobile partitions that took down here as well. And so this really survived the dissolution, because when I come to that is that a lot of these went because they're associated perhaps with the Roman Catholic Church, or perhaps were seen as church foundations, and maybe they had a Roman Catholic element to them. But this one survived largely because the corporation of Ripon, really under the mayor, had said around about, I guess, 1550 or something like that, is that this actually wasn't anything to do with a cathedral or to any church in it. In fact, it was a civic place, and perhaps he maybe knew people that he could have a word in the ear of and saying, look, we want to keep this on because it's good for us, and that the corporation of Ripon will pay for the upkeep of this. So that's how it really survived, when a lot were lost after the dissolution. But I guess that's a few hundred years hence from that. So we can see that this is the ruins of the chapel, and the rest of it was demolished in 1869. And just to the right of it, coming along here where this footpath is the new almshouses of 1869, funded by the Greenwood family of Ripon, and they spent £1,800 rebuilding these. But you normally can tell an almshouse from the look of them. They tend to be a long row of cottages, or a row of cottages, not saying long row of cottages. And these today are for, I can't remember when you see the doors, 1, 2, 3, 4. It would have been a central chapel in there as well when it was probably been converted now into another almshouse. But there's really, these were back-to-back almshouses. So there's 4 doors this side, 4 doors the other side, and they were very small and have always remained small ever since. This, when it was rebuilt, was still only had 1 room on the inside, and that's normally the problem with modernizing almshouses, that they're so small, because they were your bedroom, they were your, I guess you wouldn't wash in there, maybe in a tin bath, but they're also where you ate as well later on, rather than as communally to begin with, because you're meant to be really, in a way, as we'll see later on, self-sufficient to become an alms person living in one of these. And sometimes the beds were built into an alcove, so it wouldn't take up as much space, because if you've got an iron bedstead in there, it would take up the majority of the room. And obviously you'd live quite simply, because if you're poor and got a position in an almshouse, you probably didn't have much to bring with you anyway, because that's probably a problem with today. Even if you're poor, you probably still have a lot of possessions, and you got to sort of, I guess, you got to live a minimal style of life to live in one of these almshouses as well. You say most of them here, because they would have had a chapel involved in them. A lot of them still have that today, because sometimes it's a condition to be a member of a church in order to gain admittance into an almshouse, or to prove that you're associated with a local church as well. But we'll look at some of those issues later on. But you can say a row here of back-to-back 8 almshouses with very small rooms on the inside. The other one is to the north of the city, generally known to people as the Leper Chapel, but it was actually called the Hospice of St. Mary Magdalene. And because what we have here is a chapel that was in, I guess, the middle of the almshouses, because the almshouses would have been ranged around the outside of these, probably at a later date, perhaps. It's got a definite date, this one. It was founded by Archbishop Thurston in 1144. It was on a road called Stonebridge Gate, and now called Magdalen Road. So it really comes at the north into Ripon, and that's why it was probably built out there, is that it would stop these people, the lepers, coming into the city and spreading disease into that. And so this is the nearest they could properly get into it. And to say in 1342, they also accepted blind clerics in here as well, probably to take the daily services that went on in the Leper Chapel. And to say the almshouses, which are across the road, the road that comes down here is this side. So the Leper Chapel, if you're going out of Ripon, is on the right-hand side. On the other side are the more modern almshouses. So the almshouses in the medieval time would have been around the Leper Chapel, but today, in 1892, they were rebuilt on the other side of the road. These are for people aged 50 and over. I think that probably takes in all of us, who are in a condition of need, hardship or distress, who have lived in Ripon or surrounding districts for more than 5 years. And so there's quite often these stipulations put in before you can actually gain admittance. Again, we see here a row of almshouses. I think there's probably 6 in this row. I've forgotten to check. It looks like it's another type of chapel to the end there, but I'm not 100% certain. So those are sort of the 3 almshouses which are in Ripon, and you say there were as many, well, there were even more in other places. Pontefract actually had 16 almshouses, which makes it very difficult to tell the story of those, and most of those today are very modern. And same type of thing as I mentioned in Beverley. I think there were 12 or so almshouses in that city as well. So it's easier to look at the story of this, and actually you could actually walk between all these 3. These almshouses, sometimes surrounded the Leper Chapel, here they're called Maison Dieu, largely because I guess These are for visiting lepers who wanted to come and pray, I guess, near the relics of St. Wilfrid in the cathedral there. And maybe is that they weren't almshouses as we would say today. And Maison d'Eur really means is that it's a place where people could come and stay overnight, and so perhaps are expected to move on after a night or two here. And that's why when we go up to Richmond, the road that leads in from Catterick Bridge goes over the top of Easby Abbey and goes into the town where the Priory is. It celebrates its 950th year. Richmond does this year, so I guess there aren't going to be many celebrations around. But where I've taken this photograph from, this road is called Maison d'Eur, and because it means God's houses of God, and these were largely either an individual cottage or a small row of cottages, and it's rather like that leper house that would have been down at Ripon, is that these are for people just to stay overnight and move on. And so these are sort of resting houses, and I guess maybe a bit like, if people know Leeds well, St George's Crypt next door to the Leeds General Infirmary, whereas they're not open during the day, but you can go and sleep there at night, and I guess you're not expected to really to live there. You, I guess, expected perhaps to move on somewhere else, and so. We think that these were really established post the Black Death of 1349, because in towns and cities, they probably lost between 25% and 50% of the population. And therefore, I guess a lot of people became a lot more transient. There weren't as many people around as there were before. And it seems that maybe these people came to beg for alms, and maybe it was more acceptable then because there might not have been as many jobs around, certainly not as many people around. They also had competition in here up in Richmond because the Franciscan friars in the friar there, that was built in 1258. They also went around sustaining themselves by alms, by wandering the streets and things like that. And they were actually quite well liked because they weren't avaricious like the monks of, let's say, Fountains Abbey, where they were expected to be given money, whereas these monks would wander around and people would give freely of alms to them. That's normally, I guess, food, drink, and money around there. So really, this is where how it stood about sort of 1350, and we're looking at that same period as well, going over to York. With the establishment of the guilds really in this period, and there were 50 of them in York at the time, but there's only a few of the guild halls left. There's the merchant tailors, the merchant adventurers here, and the actual sort of symbolic guild hall that stands behind the mansion house down by the river down there. And so these were merchants, these were businessmen involved in trade, and built the hall in 1357. So really coming just after the Black Death, and completed in 1361. They were sort of, I guess, a grouping of businessmen that might be maybe construed as originally being maybe like a Masonic lodge or something like that, where they did trade together with themselves. But it was also a religious fraternity as well, as we see here, dedicated to Lord Jesus Christ and the Blessed Virgin Mary. And rather like a lot of these other guilds that built halls, they had an undercroft, and this is where they did their charitable deeds here. This is the undercroft here underneath the hall of the merchant adventurers, of the lower floor, and this is where their alms people lived. I guess they might have been former members, perhaps, who'd fallen perhaps on hard times, or people they worked with and knew in some way. And as we'll see here, that's where the chapel is for the guild itself. So I just chopped down this longer bit of film on the merchant adventures, which is shown, just to show you the clip, really, the minute or so, where they discuss looking at the alms accommodation down here.
Well, Stephen, now we're in the undercroft, so we're actually underneath the Great Hall where we've just been. Just remind us what happened down here?
Well, this was the hospital. This was known as Trinity Hospital from the mid 14th century, really until the company decided that it was just too unpleasant conditions for pensioners of the company, and that was about 1900. So for a very long time. But this really, and a medieval hospital, and you should remember, it wasn't a hospital as we understand it today. It was a place to offer hospitality. So it was a place for the sick, the poor, to be given shelter and to be fed. There was initially no medical treatment offered here. It was purely a place for shelter. If you needed medical treatment, you went to an infirmary in the Middle Ages, not to a hospital. Later on, there undoubtedly there was medical treatment going on down here, and in fact, in the late 18th century, in 1788, we see the start of the York dispensary in this very space, and that was actually probably the first time, certainly in this part of the country, where medicines were delivered to the poor free at the point of delivery. So perhaps the first iteration of the National Health Service.
But behind us, of course, we have a chapel.
Indeed.
That, I presumably, sort of underlines the fact that this was primarily a religious institution.
Yes, and of course, as I said, formed by a religious fraternity, the Fraternity of Our Lord Jesus Christ and the Blessed Virgin Mary. Clearly, they wanted somewhere to worship and to offer their devotions. This chapel in this location was licensed in 1411. We think.
So we had the Black Death come along in sort of 1348, 1349. This was quite swiftly followed by a Great Plague in 1362 as well. And it seems that people became more deeply religious in this time. And this is where the sort of great landowners started to build chantry chapels. And this was paid for out of their great wealth. And as part of that, it would pay for a priest to pray for their souls every day. That was a great fear, is that you would end up in hell rather than heaven. And this was sort of all part of this. And the chantrers, with that money that was donated, could do other things with it. Sometimes they mostly formed schools within these chantry chapels, which then outgrew them to become into grammar schools. And here we have an instance of the Charter House in Hull, where one of the monastic groups actually came and provided accommodation for alms people, for the poor. And the Carthusians founded the Charter House, or Sutton's Hospital as it's known, really a monastery in London in 1371. So really coming after the Black Death and the Plague and coming into that period. And then they built this property you can see here, just north of the city centre of Hull, if you know where the new theatre is, just sort of on the top side of that, so really just off the city centre. They built this in 1378. They also built the last monastery to be built in Yorkshire, Mount St Grace Priory, and that was built in 1398. To say the Carthusians were formed in France in 1084. The Hull Charter House, this is where we see a lot of support sometimes, maybe for the smaller groups that came later on by businessmen. So this was supported the building and the construction of the Charter House. So there's two elements to it really. There was the monastery itself, and then we found there's the almshouses, and then there was a school attached to that as well. And it was founded, paid for by Michael de la Pole. He was the from that family that really were the first mayors of Hull. I think it's Walter de la Pole. His statue stands on the overlooking the estuary down towards near the marina on the front of that, really opposite the museum across there. He was the first mayor of Hull, so they had a lot of money behind them. And this was built for 13 men and 13 women, and also a priest master. So this was really, there's always somebody else involved who maybe looked after the management of them, these almshouses, maybe because they were sort of in need themselves, or that they took the services within them. So there weren't doctors or nurses or anything like that, because they were meant to be people who went into here, even if they were sort of age 80, they were expected to be able to look after themselves. And so this was really the case here. And because the religious aspect of this on the inside of here in the 18th century, 17th century, was a chapel, and they've been expected to attend that chapel at least on a Sunday. The only times they've been excused for it if they were ill or incapacitated in some way. We see here the connection with the poet Andrew Marvell, because his father was the master of the Charter House in the 17th century, and he lived here and actually grew up in here, because he went to the grammar school, which was next to the parish church right in the centre of Hull. Still exists there today. Today, there are 32 flats within this complex, home for 40 residents. You must be aged over 60 and in need. So that's the Charter House, really a very fine building just to the north of the city centre of Hull. So let's have a look at the sort of what was happening in the dissolution coming sort of in 1539. It didn't really affect almshouses really at all, because the monastic orders hadn't supported them in any way, because as I said before, they only wanted people to come in who bring money to them into these great abbeys. And so it didn't really affect them at all to begin with until 1547. And that's when the chantries were dissolved by Edward VII, Henry's son, who was just aged 9 at the time. So I don't think he really had much say in it, apart from putting his moniker on a piece of paper. They were seen as sort of, again, papist superstition involved with the Roman Catholics, because these chantries were largely, attached to, which were now, I guess, parish churches and things like that. But even they were viewed from the artworks that they had in them as well as being Roman Catholics. And so these were sort of the people now who came forward, who would actually have sort of built themselves a chantry and donated the money to the church. But the problem in 1547 is that the almshouses seemed to get wrapped up with these chantries because of being funded by the wealthy landlords around the place, and therefore actually end up being dissolved. But as I mentioned, that one in St Anne's in Ripon, they got round that by saying, oh no, it's got nothing to do with the church. It's a corporation institute that we're running here. And that's the only way that they could really get round that. I'm going to say a lot of the poor rose up against the closure of these almshouses because they really had nowhere to go, even though only very few people actually were able to go and live in these almshouses against the great need that would have been there for them. Unusually, an uprising took place in the village of Stakston. That's really at the foot of Wolds, where the A64 goes through it, just before it reaches a roundabout where you can go left to Scarborough or right to Filey. And they could say a number of those leaders then were taken to York and hung. It's a very quiet, well, I wouldn't say very quiet, but there's a small village today with a huge main road running through it. But the poor issue really wouldn't go away, and it came up to Elizabeth I in 1559. She lived 1553 to 1603, so we'll see in over the next few slides the things that went on in this period. She established the Church Settlement Act that allowed tax exemption from people or charities serving the poor. And in the following year, endowments were allowed to be given to these charitable trusts for the poor up to the value of £200 a year per person or per charity, I guess. And but they could be inspected at any time in case they were suspected of Roman Catholic activity inside of them. And so benefactors came forwards, and this is why we see in the churches today the sort of benefactions that people have made to the poor generally in the parish. And this one here is the establishment of almshouses and other things in Halifax by Nathaniel Waterhouse. Now, like a lot of the benefactors at this time, is that if they become wealthy, and didn't have anywhere to leave their money, maybe because they were largely because they were probably childless or lost all their children in birth and growing up. And they now gave this money largely towards the poor. It's one of the ways that they could, in their wills, get rid of the money to stop maybe other people claiming on it, or it going to institutions that they didn't want to leave money for. So they tend to leave money for almshouses, for schools, and maybe other charitable things. And so Nathaniel Waterhouse of Halifax, he was a salter, and so made a lot of money because salt was such a valuable commodity at that time, a lot of it coming over from Cheshire, but required everywhere because other salt came from the coast from drying out the seawater. And he gave £3,304 and 9 shillings to schools and almshouses, with the Waterhouse charity still existing today, and they still have modern almshouses in the town of Halifax. And if you go into the Minster, or the parish church as it is known, is that there's a Commonwealth window down there made of clear glass, and that was paid for by Nathaniel Waterhouse as well. And really, this is a copy of his will establishing the almshouses for those people in Halifax. And like I say, that will date from around, I haven't got his date here, but if he gave a Commonwealth window, it'd be in the sort of 1630s, 1640s period that he will have died. And if you come over here, this is one of these bequest boards for charities, and this is in the church of out at I've lost my place now, out at Hornsey, and where people have listed down what they've left. And really this was quite important because quite a lot of these wills, as we'll see later on, were contested by the members of the family. They didn't like large sums being left to almshouses and other charitable things when they decided that they should have that money and could actually spin out in court the wills of these people, and that the almshouses which were eventually built were built decades after the money had been given. And so I guess this was part of the reason why of having these charity boards in churches, is that it would stipulate what these people want, and therefore other people couldn't really get away from it later on by not doing what these charity boards say. So round about 1660, there are about 83 almshouses in Yorkshire, and I'm going to say all over the place, so not really serving that many people particularly. And there's a sort of further 29 people, 29 organisations that worked with the poor as well, sometimes just donating sums of money rather than sort of looking after them as well. So here we see over the charity board here in Hornsey, let me have a quick look here. We've got second left down the board. So here we are. We have there William Day's bequest. He died aged 34 on the 22nd of May, 1616. That charity still exists from that date. And he said he's going to give 40 shillings yearly to be given to the poor by the minister and church wardens at Christmas and Easter. And then if we look at the one of Peter Acklam down here, by will dated in 1758, charged a house in Hornsey, formerly called Low Hall, and now the Old Hotel, now the property of the Reverend Constable of Wassend, etc., that this was to become an almshouse, and he was given a certain amount of money for that. That almshouse still exists, not the original one that was built at that time, but that was replaced in 1908 with the almshouses that are seen today further down from the church itself. And one way of sort of maintaining these almshouses was that here they say is, I think is given a settlement there of £5, which is probably a great deal of money in those days. But it was up to the trustees, or probably in this case here, the vicar and the church warden, because there's normally, that if you're going to become a trustee, you probably have to be seen as having to do good deeds. And it was also worth having a number of people on as a trustee who were quite wealthy, because they could then endow these almshouses and other things by topping them up. Because that was a problem with them, is that they would have to invest that money in order to get a return. And obviously things in this period, like the South Sea bubble, meant that they could lose all their money in one go through poor investment. So they actually had to decide whether it's going to be a safe investment, giving a small return every year, or they're going to try and be maybe a little bit more reckless and get a greater return on those. But normally, having money wasn't normally a very good thing to have, because those myriad number of private banks and all sorts of other things where you could easily lose your money. And the best sort of thing to have was to have these almshouses endowed with lands or with properties, which meant that the rental income from those properties, which would be known as a fixed asset and would increase over in time, could then pay for the maintenance of the almshouses and the rebuilding of them, modernization of them. And quite often these almshouses, we'll see later on, came with pensions as well, because these were very poor people towards the end of their lives who probably had no savings. Well, you probably had to have no savings at all in order to become as part of that. These are mostly women as well, because they had lost maybe perhaps their main breadwinner, their husband, or through no fault of their own, have become poor and destitute. And that's how they probably got into an almshouse as well. And so if we look at another one that has been done here, Beamsley Hospital by the side of the Harrogate Road, by the Bolton Abbey roundabout. And this was probably a case of that the Bolton Priory had been dissolved in 1539. They would have provided alms to those people who would have walked out there, because it's quite a long walk if you had to go out there to these remote areas. It's 7 miles from Skipton itself. And that was probably partly a problem with Beamsley Hospital being established here, is that, how do you look after yourself if you lived in the almshouses down here? So they were founded by Margaret Clifford. She was the Countess of Cumberland. The Clifford family lived out at Skipton Castle. She was born 1560, died 1667. She had this circular building, the almshouse, built in 1593, and you'll see on the bit of film, it's got a chapel at the centre of it. The almshouses you see at the beginning of the film that face onto the road were built by her daughter, Lady Anne Clifford. She was born 1590, died 1676. She, because they built the ones which aren't as ornate, which face onto the road, probably fought in either in the 1620s or the 1630s that they were built, but they were built more as a traditional row of almshouses there. And it's you go through a gateway underneath these the row of cottages to see the Beamsley Hospital, the one of 1593 that stands behind. There's a plaque on that passage that passes through there that says, "This almshouse was founded by the excellent Lady Margaret Russell," that was her maiden name, "Countess of Cumberland, wife of George Clifford, 3rd Earl of Cumberland, 1593, and was more perfectly finished by her only child, the Lady Annie Clifford, Countess Dowager of Pembroke, Dorset and Montgomery. God's name be praised." In total, in the circular one here, there's accommodation for a mother. Like I say, this is only for alms women here at Beamsley. And like I said, there's a chapel in the centre. The room straight across the chapel is where the mother lived. Like I say, she wasn't a nurse, but would have looked after the inhabitants of the almshouses. And their rooms, as you see on a bit of film, range off the chapel. Like I say, they're sort of like slices of cake. So once you got your bed in there, there wasn't much of a room in there. The importance of things like this is that, and all the other almshouses, is that they all had fires in them. And so that was a fires used, because they were normally ate communally, but the fires for heating, for drying clothes and boiling water and other things like that. So always importance of the heating in there as well. And 7 of these alms women lived in the circular ones. There's 6 bedrooms off, the 7th one being for the mother of it. And again, when that row was built in front, there's accommodation there for another 6 alms women. So bringing that in total to 14, is it, or something like that, that live there. I don't know when it stopped being used, but it was taken over by the Landmark Trust in 1993, and this circular one is now rented out as a holiday accommodation. So let's have a look at this.
Besides the religious side to the Priory, they provided alms to local people, especially the old, sick and poor that ceased with the dissolution in 1539. To fill this gap, Lady Anne Clifford had 6 almshouses built at Beamsley in 1593. But it was her mother, Margaret, who built the hospital, which is accessed through the archway that leads to the hospital. A most unusual building. Not only is it circular, but it also has a raised centre where windows, arranged like a lantern, provide the light. Why? In the centre is a chapel, with pews arranged around the walls. From here, 5 doors lead off to the 7 bedrooms for the infirm. Each room has its own fire, and just enough room for a bed and some belongings. Since 1981, the Landmark Trust has looked after the building, and it is rented out as holiday accommodation, the most unusual in the area.
I don't know who got the dates wrong, me or the when I first wrote that script back in 2005, and the Landmark Trust gave me permission to go in there when there was a changeover on a Friday. So we see 1593 a date then, and things were starting to change in just after that in 1601. To change, there's a great change just after that of the building in 1593 with the coming of the Poor Law in 1601, another of Elizabeth's acts that she enacted before she died in 1603. And really there were great fears about the growing number of poor, and they felt that they could band together and create rebellions, or that they had turned to crime and were targeting the rich estates and stealing not sort of harvest of apples and crops and things like that, but also stealing and pilfering other goods from these large houses. And the other fear was that, maybe quite rightly, but they were spreading disease. And so Elizabeth could say, although she'd come up with the Settlement Act in 1559, is that there was still something to be done and to provide relief for the poor. And this meant contributing financially somehow. And I guess she came up with the poor rate, a tax on those living within a parish to pay for the upkeep of their poor. I'm going to say, if you didn't pay the poor relief tax element, your local JP, Justice of the Peace, could fine you, confiscate goods, or even imprison you. And so the poor were really now classed into 2 groups, those that were generally too old, poor, or infirm to look after themselves, and those that had become unemployed or simply didn't want to work, because they were part of the 1572 Vagabonds Act, where they could be driven out of a parish. And one important document that you had to have, which is I've pictured here, is a settlement document. And this showed which parish that you were born into. Even if you only lived there for a short time, maybe you were born there and 3 weeks later you moved somewhere else, is that this settlement document proved the parish that you were born in. And it meant that if you'd moved to another parish and become a burden on the poor rate, is that parish then could remove you back to the parish that you were actually born in, which meant by the parish constable. He would forcibly take you there and charge the parish for the pleasure of him probably staying overnight and having food and victuals and transport and things like that. And so he'd remove you back to the parish that you came from. So that we can see on this document here, it's of a bloke called John Ramsden. I can't quite, oh, here's his name, Ramsbottom, down here. And it also then included, because he was head of a household, his wife wouldn't be recognised legally. And so it was his settlement document that came into play, and also included his 3 children. They were living in Skipton at the time and were removed back to the parish of Bowling, up out on the outskirts of Bradford, near where the M601 is. That's where in that area is. So therefore he was removed back there, and then that parish will then have to pay for his upkeep around that. And so the parish in turn looked after their poor in 2 ways. And one of those is that financial relief was given. So maybe a cottage was found for John Ramsbottom. The parish might have well paid that rent on that cottage if it didn't own it. And they'd also give him a sum of money every week. So if he was young enough and had got 3 young children, is that maybe they would find jobs themselves and then could come off parish relief and eventually, because they look after themselves. Like I say, if you couldn't look after yourself, then the parish then sort of developed a poorhouse, which was a building owned by the parish. And so they were essentially almshouses then, and because where that you'd be placed to go and live in, and essentially then you'll get a bit of money every week to buy your clothes and food, and I guess is that people associated you with that poorhouse and they were paying the poor rate, then perhaps the community would also look after you in some way. We know that if generally that people went into almshouses had no immediate family to look after them. But sometimes if it did, a far-flung relation or a girl, she might actually maybe become employed, not live in the almshouse, but live nearby to look after those people in the almshouse by getting the food for them if they're immobile, looking after them, getting them, basically running around after them. The jobs that the matron wouldn't do, because she wasn't expected to do that type of jobs, other people to come and do it. She was just really managing the almshouse. And that was really effective for the next 200 years, how that worked. And it was really a local community support system that worked well. And so if we're going to look at some other of these almshouses, I'll stop in a minute. I'm just looking down after the this next slide, because I'm now looking at them as I've always have to. I've been looking at them in chronological order, and so although I'm looking at the poorhouse next, is that it was established after Trinity House in Scarborough was built. This is on the south side of St Sepulchre Street. It's a street that I guess people don't go along today, but when I look at the market halls, and I guess that's probably next week, is that if you go behind the market hall in Scarborough, that lies on Westborough, which is the main road that leads down to the beach and comes out by the harbour down there. And so the market hall just stands off there. There's a street that runs down the backside of the market hall, called St Sepulchre Street, and goes in an area that visitors don't normally go into, but it's a lovely area around that. So I recommend that. This was founded in 1602, so that 1 year just after the Poor Law Act that came in by Elizabeth. But really what we see today is what was rebuilt in 1832. And it's, as it says up here, the Hospital of Trinity House. It's got a boat there, and it's got the founded year there, 1601, and the year that it was rebuilt in 1832. So it says hospital up there, but you can say if the brass plaque down there on the front door says that it belongs to the Seafarers Trust, and can say it remains a charity to this day. and provides accommodation for retired sailors, so an almshouse for really that trade only. And that's what's quite interesting to see now, is that these different groups are now coming into it. It wasn't just maybe the wealthy that were providing for it, but these sort of trade organizations, really a continuation of what the guilds were doing in the medieval period, now coming along and looking after themselves. Because it's not this Trinity House here isn't associated with Trinity House in London, but is associated with Trinity House in Hull, that provides the large building there down by the parish church. They didn't directly have almshouses themselves. George might say that they did, but because that's slightly behind the building, but not in direct running by themselves. But up here, I guess the local branch, I guess, decided to build this, and because they have two locations in Scarborough, providing 25 one-bedroom flats. So I mentioned those poor houses a minute ago. One still exists, and that's if you're up in Knaresborough. This is just off the market square. The road here leads down to the railway station. The castle vaults, the Knaresborough Castle is just behind. So it's on that short bit of road just off the market square themselves. You say it's now a cafe called Six Poor Folk, and it was first mentioned in a survey of 1611 as being an almshouse for these types of people. I'm going to say it wasn't the only almshouse that stood in Knaresborough. There's another one that stood down by the river, where there's a long building down there. It was originally the Claro Laundry, and because that was built on waterside. So that was another poor house as well. Probably just mentioning, because I'm not really going to mention Knaresborough again, but at Starbeck there was, and indeed in there was a sort of workhouse down there. Knaresborough had a workhouse later built on. And if you go look into the wider aspects of the Knaresborough district, there was Scotland Bank Hospital, an isolation hospital, all these things which I'll be mentioning later on when I come to part 2 on Wednesday.